Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. I'm going to take a reminiscent look at the good old days. I'm being interviewed today by my friend and former colleague, Allan Muir, who was our hockey analyst and editor back in the day and has done a number of hobby jobs. He was working on an article for the Vintage magazine that Beckett puts out. And for some reason, he wanted to have a conversation with me. And it was about the buying trips, the situation back in the 70s, for me at least, in the pre-price guide days, what it was like when I was a dealer, I was a collector, very active. And I wasn't the only one, but I'd go around, try to buy cards. You put an ad in the paper. So that's what it's about. But first, thanks sponsors, Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication, ComC.com, Burbank Sports Cards, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Heritage Auctions, Huggins & Scott Auctions, as well as Topps, Panini, and Upper Deck. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. I'm going to let Al tease it out of me because he's a good interviewer, and I don't think we've exhausted it, but it was an awful lot of fun. And again, it was the wild, wild west. Again, no price guides. I remember buying cards in Hawaii. I could do a whole separate episode about some cards I bought in Hawaii over when my parents used to live over there, and I put an ad in the paper. I put an ad in the paper when I was at Fort Bliss when I was in the Army, and got a couple of nice collections there, as well as up in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, West Virginia, Pennsylvania when I was up there. So this episode coming up is I'm going to turn it over to Al for his interviewing skill. And I'm just going to try to answer the questions for Al, and I hope you enjoy. If you do or don't, I am available at drjamesbeckett@gmail.com. So feel free to email me with your thoughts, whether it's for a suggestion for a future episode or further amplification of something that has already been done. But just want to say thanks, Al, for taking time, and hope you listeners enjoy it. So here we go with the interview.
We're thinking about the early days of the hobby back in the 70s when obviously there were a number of dealers around the country who were advertising in magazines, Sporting News, Sport, and all that, looking to buy and sell cards. But the more adventurous out there, including you, were actually picking up and traveling around the country, barnstorming to Holiday Inns around the Midwest or the East Coast, looking to buy cards. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that and how that got started?
Well, it was a small fraternity. I mean, it really wasn't that many. And when you talk about the Sporting News and the kind of magazine ads, again, we're talking about the early mid 70s. There weren't many people doing that, but I think again, I'm kind of a math guy. I would say for every person that wants to put their collection in the mail to someone sight unseen through a classified ad in the Sporting News, there are 10 that would go down to their local Holiday Inn if somebody was in their town offering to pay cash for cards. And so I kind of came in on that. My friend Gervis had done some of those Sporting News ads, and again, I think it was fruitful for those guys in those days. But it was so much more fruitful to set up in a small to medium-sized town or bigger town, but certainly the small towns. The ads in the newspapers. You're going to be at a local, interesting hotel that was, understood where it was, and just bring your cards. And what you're hoping for is somebody that said, I have too many to bring. And that didn't happen very often. But usually throw the cards in the back seat. Again, we're talking about, we weren't interested in cards that were from the 70s. It was all, and even the 60s were thought to be not so great, but right. Anything the 50s or before. And the guys that did that, there was a risk because you take out your ad in the paper, and maybe a bunch of people would come, maybe not many would come, but people. This is pre-price guide days, so. But Kit Young was doing it. The number of guys that that would be names that people would recognize from the past.
So, what were the logistics of this sort of thing? Like you would go for a week, 2 weeks, a weekend, and you just.
It's almost always a weekend. I mean, I guess some guys would do. Kit Young did a circuit, where he'd go because he was on West Coast most of those days before he was half the time in Hawaii. But when he was on the West Coast, he'd make a little circuit and he'd schedule it out and put the ads in the local papers. And in those days, you just would have like a mocked up little display ad. You probably would show. I would show 56 tops card or something to get so that somebody would recognize and or put a Gaudi card, you put, or even a T206. You depends on where you were, but you wanted to buy older cards. And generally for me, I was a professor back or a grad student. Actually, most of this was when I was a professor, so I had weekends off. And so you just would go and you'd be there. A lot of times it was 1 day, sometimes it was 2 days, rarely 3 days. But and then you'd have to reload them. The scarce commodity in those days for me was money. I had a lot of knowledge. I had a lot of interest. I had plenty of experience from doing that. But you'd have to, I remember the first one I did, I had to go to a bank and get a loan for $1,000. And I was a young, assistant professor. And they said, "What do you need the money for? You buying a house?" No, I'm going to buy cards. Car? You want to buy a car loan? No, I want to buy cards. And I paid it back. And so I got a 1 year loan at whatever percent interest it was, and paid it back in 2 weeks. And so then after that, I kind of got rolling. But you had to have cash. That's the other. You couldn't say, "Hey, there wasn't any credit card stuff or write a check." They'd laugh at you. You'd have to have cash. And but again, a little bit of cash would go a long way in those days.
Yeah, and like you said, there were no price guides. There was no real agreed upon value for what cards were worth. In those days, a lot of things were selling for pennies, literally pennies.
Right. Yeah. Well, a lot of the stuff that was bought, what would that be? Gosh, that would be 50 years ago. Stuff from 50 years ago. Yeah. Basically the prices have gone up by 100x.
Right.
Stuff that I bought for $10 then is worth $1,000 now. So, that's cool, except that you have to live for 50 extra years to have that happen. But again, the cash would go a long way. You didn't want to run out of cash, and rarely ran out of cash. The sweet spot that was kind of interesting, you're from Canada, is that the bigger cities in those days, like Detroit, up in your area, people would come from Canada into Detroit or Toronto. The big cities were starting to have shows. And so that wasn't the best place because people could bring their cards to a show. Mm-hmm. But if you were in a smaller town, so not Cleveland, but Youngstown, or not Cincinnati, but Dayton, or not Chicago, but Champaign or Peoria or something. So if you were more than an hour away from one of the big cities, there were still a lot of collectors there. There weren't card shops at that point. Just was a point in time, Al. You can't, guys are still doing that to some degree. There was somebody that came through here a few months ago doing that, but it's, again, now people are armed with price guides but on the other hand, cash is king.
So give me a sense of what one of those days was like. You and Gervis would be set up in a hotel room at a Holiday Inn in Champaign or whatever. Would there be like a line of people? What was it like on that day?
First of all, Gervis and I we're great friends, and we never did that.
Okay.
Never did it. At point, because most of that was before I moved back to Dallas.
Okay.
So I did stuff with Gervis before I went away to Bowling Green, but most of this was when I was in Bowling Green,
okay.
Where I was a single professor. I had extra money and extra time, but I had different other kind of partners, business partners. It was good cop, bad cop is kind of an oversimplification, but it just was good to have two people involved. So most of them were a couple of guys. Now the trick is, which Gervis and I never had. Gervis and I did buy collections, but it was in the context of when I was a part owner of First Base. And he was super fair. I've always been blessed with great partners, but divvying the stuff up is not trivial. When in those days there were most of the guys, there's this controversy: is it okay to be an investor, or do you have to be a pure collector? Well, all the guys that I knew that were doing that had a little bit of both. They if they were making money on cards, in most cases they were pouring it back into their own collection. But these were pretty intense guys who are willing to take a risk. And again, in the pre-price guide guys, you had to know what you were doing. You couldn't overpay. You couldn't let something get away. If you'd never seen something and there was no price guide, you just know, I've been to all these shows and I know I've seen all this and I've never seen this. So whether it's worth $1 a card or $10 a card or $100 a card, you just wanted to try to get it and then figure out what it was later. And when you went to a card show in those days, having scarce cards was better than cash.
What about like any great finds you had? What was the best thing that ever walked in through the door?
Well, some of the best stuff I told. I had a podcast episode about this. That one of the best things was an unopened case where I threw away the unopened case. I mean, I kept the cards, I kept the wax boxes and the wax packs and all that stuff, but I got rid of the case box, which was truly rare.
Worth hundreds of dollars now, yeah.
And the same thing with I probably to a fault was interested in the cards. Yeah. And so the wrappers weren't a big deal. The boxes weren't a big deal, but I had a number of, early Bowman, wax pack boxes that I just literally gave away. And it would have been a great collection. So and yet I kept the cards. I mean, I did fine, but I basically kept stuff that I could. I didn't keep a lot of the oversized stuff, which T3s and things like that. I thought I haven't got boxes to fit these. I'll just trade them off. And again, it's the same penny on the dollar worked against me there.
Yeah. So I've heard horror stories as well. I know there were stories of dealers that were held up because people knew that they had cash on hand in their rooms. Did you hear any stories like that, or were you involved in?
No, we never got held up. And that's one of the good reasons to have two, and to make sure that you're talking to the that it's a nice hotel, not super nice, but I mean a nice hotel or motel, whatever. That they understood what you were doing. Not that they were going to provide security, but they just knew. But we got poached. We got poached more than once out of a number of times of doing this. All of a sudden, that we'd have a steady stream of customers coming in, and then it stopped, and it went out to the front desk to figure out what was going on. And there was a guy sitting in the hotel saying, "Hey, I'm the guy," and they never got back to us.
Sure.
So we complained to the hotel manager. In one case, they evicted him. In another case, the hotel manager was convinced by the person, who was a local person, that we were carpetbaggers, even though we were coming from across the state.
Yeah, right.
We were not from around here. And so why give them preference? I said, well, we paid for the room.
Right.
If you're sitting in the lobby. And, but the hotel manager was adamant. And so we wound up getting about half what we would have gotten. So we went out. And so again, with two of us, we took turns, one of us sitting in the lobby, and we wound up getting in a bidding war with this other guy.
Yeah.
He's a big guy, and he was well, I guess it's statute of limitations now, but he was more of a comic book guy. And so I said, look, if anybody comes in with comic books or non-sport cards, we won't bid against you to have them. But if it's any baseball cards, before 1960, that's what we're here for. Just let us have that. You can have the other. We're not going anywhere. If there's any collection we don't get, we'll give you the names of the person. You can follow up, because we're a couple hundred miles away. But that was not fun. I mean, I don't like conflict. And like I say, there are worse stories than what we experienced, because again, people know you're going to have cash sitting there. You're sitting in a hotel room,
right?
And bad things could happen.